Hi, everyone. Welcome to session F5, where we're going to be talking about some outreach and communication. The session is entitled Language Matters in Risk Communication. I'm Jerry Daniels with Dewberry Engineering. So welcome everyone today. We're going to start the first session presentation, which is by Samara Ebinger with the New Hampshire Office of Strategic Initiatives. All right, so on to the presentation.
Hi everyone, I'm Samara Ebinger from the New Hampshire Office of Strategic Initiatives. We are the agency that coordinates the National Flood Insurance Program in New Hampshire, and we're also a member of the New Hampshire Silver Jackets team. That is why I'm here speaking to you today to talk about our most recent completed project, the Flood Hazards Handbook. For anyone who isn't familiar with the Silver Jackets program, I believe there's a Silver Jackets team in every state and in DC. And these are comprised of federal and state agencies working together on flood risk management issues. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers plays an important coordination role, and other federal agencies like FEMA are also engaged too. But they are state-led teams. The Flood Hazards Handbook. So we completed this last fall, and it's a quick reference guide for municipal officials in the state. It's intended to help them better prepare for, respond to, recover from, and mitigate floods. Again, the handbook is for municipal officials, really anyone who's involved in a flood-related activity. So that could include emergency managers, it could include planners, building inspectors if a community has those, town or city administrators, board members. Here in New England, we have what are called select boards, which are their elected officials who help govern a community. We've got planning boards, conservation commissions, etc. So you could have one person, two people performing these flood-related activities, or you could have quite a few people involved, depending on the resources of the community, the size, etc. So why is this handbook needed? Well, most communities in our state are quite small. They don't have a lot of resources. Also, the last really major flood in the state was back in 2011 with Tropical Storm Irene. So you have a lot of community officials right now who don't have knowledge that they've gained from being in an actual flood event and experiencing what happens and the recovery and response, etc. So this handbook is really intended to help municipal officials get up to speed on a lot of these different topics, give them easier access to guidance and potential assistance and resources from federal and state agencies. It's not intended to replace one-on-one visits, although obviously these days those one-on-one visits are not being done in person, but it's really intended to supplement those. Our inspiration for this handbook was the Iowa Flood Response Toolkit. This was developed by the Iowa Department of Natural Resources a few years ago. It was developed for the DNR by the Iowa Floodplain and Stormwater Management Association with assistance from the consultant Dewberry. We really liked the structure of this document and the topics that it covered. We thought it would be a really good fit for New Hampshire as well. And I did contact the DNR to make sure that to get their blessing for us to kind of take their idea and run with it for our state, and they were fine with it. They're very gracious. They actually provided some of the native files from their toolkit that we could use and repurpose. We ended up probably 90% of our handbook is content we developed ourselves, but it was great to have the starting point. That was really a time saver. So I think every agency on our Silver Jackets team was involved in this project and either developed content for it or served as a reviewer. This is a list of all of them right here. At the beginning, so we worked collaboratively to come up with an outline of all of the topics that we wanted to cover, and then each agency was assigned either to develop that content or serve in a review role. Beyond those topics, we also had some other requirements to make sure that this was really a usable document. The first one, so trying to keep it relatively short, I use the word relatively because it's about 80 pages long, which is not really short, but I guess in comparison to a 500-page manual, yes, it's sort of short, but just really trying to distill it to the most important information that a municipal official would need and include links to more information so that people would know where to learn more about a particular topic. So this handbook is intended to be used by a number of different types of municipal officials. They come from different backgrounds, professionally, educationally. So it was really important to make sure that we were using plain language, not using a lot of technical terms, to the best of our ability, to make sure that people really could understand what we're trying to say. And then the last thing, obviously, this handbook is for municipal officials, so we obviously want them involved in the process. And so we had, I think, 4 or 5 municipal officials who served as reviewers for our first draft, and they really provided a lot of valuable feedback and made this a much better product than it otherwise would have been. So the handbook, it contains basic information about a number of flood-related topics. I'll show you a list of the specific topics in just a moment. We organized it into 4 major sections: before the flood, during the flood, after the flood, the short-term recovery, and then after the flood, longer-term recovery considerations. We've got information about resources and assistance available from federal and state sources, other private sector sources as well. And it was really important for us to include resources to help improve a community's resilience out like in peacetime, not when a flood is actually occurring or has happened, to ensure that people can be taking action now so that the effects of flooding in the future will not be as pronounced. And so this is a handbook that's intended to be used not just when a flood is imminent or during those recovery or response phases, but just, on sunny days when there's no event occurring. This slide, this is just an example of what one of the pages looks like here. We tried to keep each subtopic to just 1 page. In some cases, if it was a particularly complex topic or if it was a really important one, then we would use more than 1 page. And we color-coded each section so that people could easily flip through, and if they're, if they wanted to just get the content for a particular stage, then they could easily find that particular section. This slide, so this shows the different topics we covered in the before the flood section. I'm not going to go through everything on this slide, but this just gives you an idea. And the agency that developed the content is listed in parentheses. I'll just point out again, we did the planning piece of this was really important in before the flood, because again, we want communities to be thinking about what they can do now to improve their community resilience, flood resilience in the future. Another theme that runs through the whole handbook is about public outreach and how important that really is in terms of the community officials communicating with their residents. We tried to include ready-made content that they can access, links to it that they can easily use just as is, or easily customize to make it as easy as possible for them to get that information out to people. So this is the during the flood section. Our Homeland Security and Emergency Management Department at the state prepared a lot of this because this is really in their purview. Again, the public outreach component is, we've got that in this section as well, because, and we also include like a bulleted list of what are those things you should be communicating at this stage when a flood is happening. And then after the flood, the short-term recovery, obviously there's a lot more stuff in this section because there's a lot of stuff that's got to be done after a flood. In the NFIP section we do focus a lot on the substantial damage requirement because that is so critical. FEMA is really placing a great emphasis on that these days for good reason. And in terms of assistance, we've got information about assistance for communities, but also information about assistance that residents can use as well, that communities can perform outreach on. So like FEMA individual assistance, SBA loans, etc. And then after the flood, long-term recovery, this is obviously shorter, but also really important, where we're focusing on mitigation options, post-flood assessments by the USGS and the National Weather Service. So one thing that several of our reviewers suggested was the development of a checklist that municipal officials could use when a flood was imminent, and then also covering those response and recovery phases. We thought that was a great idea. We actually were able to use and tweak an existing checklist that one of our regional planning commissions had put together. It's in an Excel format, so communities can customize it as they see fit. We have also got page numbers referenced from specific pages in the handbook that contain related content. Outreach, this is obviously a really important part of the project because, we can develop this shiny, nice document, but if nobody knows about it, that doesn't really help anyone. So we did have an outreach plan that we put together ahead of time. We developed outreach content that our Silver Jackets team agencies could use. They can provide to their public information officer, get that information to them, and they can either use it as is or tweak it as they see fit. We also developed a slightly different version for our external partners who are involved in flood risk management as well. We developed a one-page fact sheet that could be printed and handed out at conferences or training events, that sort of thing. And so we did do a lot of outreach in the fall about this when we did release it. The handbook is available online, so it's out there, but our friends at HSEM did print out hard copies enough so that every community in the state could have one of them. And what we had been doing sort of on a piecemeal basis was just handing out those hard copies at training events, you know, CABs and CACs that our agency holds, local conferences. We were planning to get them out during those, but unfortunately, because of the coronavirus situation, all of that has been put on hold. So we still have a lot of hard copy distribution to do, and hopefully we'll be able to continue with that soon when it's safe to do so. The best way to measure effectiveness of this handbook is probably going to be after a major flood event. I don't think anyone wants that to happen, particularly now. So this is something we'll revisit in the future. We, of course, would welcome feedback from municipal officials at any time to hear about how effective or not effective it is for them. I think it would also be helpful at some point for us to do a survey to make sure people are aware of this handbook once we've completed our distribution, to make sure we're getting it to the right people. So future activities that we'll be working on, again, distribution of the hard copies, outreach at future conferences. We were planning to do a workshop with municipal officials about the handbook and covering specific topics. That isn't going to happen anytime soon, so hopefully we can revisit that maybe next year. We'll be making updates on a yearly basis, just checking links to make sure they're still working, that sort of thing. And at some point we'll do like a 2.0 release where we'll be making more significant updates. That will be after we get feedback from municipal officials, of course. But I think the other thing that will be important will be to engage other agencies outside of our Silver Jackets team, because I know that there are some gaps in the handbook that you come across a resource from an agency that's not on our team. It's like, oh, that would have been really great to include in the handbook. So that stuff is out there. I think we just need to widen the net and talk to some of our partner agencies at the state level and at the federal level who aren't on our Silver Jackets team but do have a role to play when it comes to flood risk. So that is pretty much it. Again, we're really hopeful that this will be a useful tool for our municipal officials. It's going to be a living document, so we're committed to making it, to continually improving it based on feedback from the users of the document. If you're interested in taking a look, feel free to download a copy from the link shown. Otherwise, thanks for watching. I hope you stay safe. I hope you stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, Samara, for that presentation. That was really good. I really like the idea of that resource book, that handbook for those community officials, especially the checklist that you mentioned. That's really awesome. We do have a few minutes for questions. I don't really see any, but Samara's going to make a few more remarks while we allow time for you. If you have a question, please type it in the chat box. And Samara did post the link to the handbook in the chat box as well, so you can access that there. So Samara, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, in watching the presentation again, I realized I didn't really talk about some of the challenges that we encountered in developing the handbook. So a few things that come to my mind. I was responsible for kind of weaving all of the different pieces, the different content from all of the agencies together. And so trying to get it to read just in one voice, it was sort of a challenge, since there were like literally 20 different authors of content. So that was one of the things we weren't completely thinking about at the beginning, that would be a fairly time consuming process. The other thing was, this seems to always be a struggle when I'm developing some kind of outreach document or materials, is we just trying to find relevant photos is always, or graphics is always kind of not as easy as you would think it would be. So there, depending on the content, we did pull a lot of graphics and photographs from FEMA. Their media library was really helpful. Most of them were New Hampshire photos, but some of them were just places that kind of looked like New Hampshire. So those were probably two of the biggest challenges. In general, it was really a great experience working with everyone. Everyone was very conscientious of getting content done on time, following the guidelines that was sent out. So that was kind of that that was the remainder of the comments that came to mind when I was watching the presentation.
Okay. I don't see where we've gotten any questions in the chat box while you were talking. So I think we're good. It's really great to see you again, Samara. It's been a while. All right. So I think we will now go on to the next presentation, which is by Jim Keith with Friesen Nichols. And his presentation is entitled "The Problem with Unprecedented," with quotes, "unprecedented mitigation, misinformation, and improving risk communication." All right, so we will go to the presentation now.
It's called "The Problem with Unprecedented." And I'll start by acknowledging that we are in truly unprecedented times right now. The idea for this presentation goes back really a year or so, and well before we're in the situation we're in now. But it stemmed from hearing about flood events repeatedly, hearing this term unprecedented over and over again, and it really just kind of started to ring in my ears.
But in recent days, the amount of rain, especially in Kerala, has been unprecedented in recent history.
By August 31st, an unprecedented amount of rain caused equipment at the Arkema plant to flood and fail.
There was an unprecedented flooding in the country.
China is experiencing unprecedented flooding, with high waters rising extremely quickly.
Today, that's when you get unprecedented flooding.
Flooding was really unprecedented.
Unprecedented flood.
In 1903, an unprecedented flood struck Kansas.
The flood caused an unprecedented loss of assets and a cessation of trade, stimulating a substantial recession, or let's say a pretty big little depression.
Well, this guy's got it right. All this talk about unprecedented was giving me a little depression. And I thought about Inigo Montoya's famous words. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. And what does unprecedented really mean? Okay, there you have it, unprecedented, without precedence. And it's a very powerful word, and one that you think you wouldn't have to use very often. And yet, as you saw in those clips, it's been used over and over and over again. And so, as we use those words, they lose their meaning. When we look back to some of the flood events in the past 5 years, there's been some very significant ones. We've got some of these that are actually unprecedented in some instances. Hurricane Harvey is a great example of that. And the 2016 Louisiana floods were also unprecedented and unusual in that they stem from just very heavy rainfall and not associated with Mississippi River levee flooding or coastal flooding due to some sort of tropical system. But as you look at some of these other events, you know, the Maryland flooding in 2016, the first time that happened, was a very rare event, probably unprecedented for that town, and yet 2 years later they had the very same flooding occur. Houston obviously got hit kind of back-to-back, 2015 in Memorial Day, and 2016 in the Tax Day flooding. So unfortunately, what this shows us is we've been getting a lot of unprecedented extreme flooding events, but it's making that word lose its meaning. And so this is what got me thinking about how we talk about these flood events. The words that we use have power, but that power diminishes when the words begin to lose their meaning. Within the engineering and insurance industry, we throw a lot of technical jargon around. We have a lot of statistics and probability terms that a lot of people don't understand. Our intentions are good, but we don't seem to be helping people change their behavior. And so we started thinking about some of the biggest challenges. As an engineer, I spent most of the past 20 years focused more on the technical challenges. How do we get better data? How do we improve the accuracy of our models? And how in the world are we going to get these maps adopted? Those were the questions that I was focused on. And lately I started to think more about the communication challenges and the challenges associated with changing people's behavior. So that's what got me to this point of wondering, is there a better way? And this presentation is the first step on my journey to help solve that problem with unprecedented. So one of the first places to start is how we talk about floods and natural disasters. Many of you have probably seen this quote from Gilbert White about floods are acts of God, flood losses are acts of man. And this is true. Floods and hurricanes are going to continue to happen, and we can't stop that. And what former Administrator Fugate highlights in his quote is that the hazard itself is not the disaster. It's how we're living and building in these areas. That's what causes the disaster. So let's talk about some of the storm event nomenclature that gets thrown around. Some of these are necessary evils, right? The 100-year storm, the 1% annual chance event. We have to have a way to measure and quantify events as part of what we do and the engineering work that we do and the projects that we design. But another great Gilbert White quote is that the 1% annual chance event was a compromise from the start. So it was, I like to say, it was actuarially convenient to use that number. These terms can be both hard to explain and hard to understand from others. And then other words like catastrophic, extreme, unprecedented, again, they suffer from this repeated usage. So I sent out a brief survey to I'm going to call my group of flood colleagues, and these are people that I had either worked with or kind of come across over the years, and some of them I just kind of knew of and hit them up out of the blue with their input. But you're going to see the responses to the questions here as we work through the presentation. And the first question I asked were, what are the greatest challenges for risk communication? So I got a lot of great responses. This first one is on this lack of understanding around probability. I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of the just confusing nature of probability and statistics. But a thing to point out here is the scientific limitations aspect. And the models that we use have this sort of false sense of accuracy because of the precision that we report numbers in. When we give a water surface elevation to 1/100th of a foot, people assume that that means that model is very accurate, and that may not always be the case. We have a lot of technical details that overwhelm these simple truths that we're trying to get across. One of those I'm going to talk more about today is just the simple truth that everyone has some flood risk, and conveying that spectrum of flood risk that exists. Getting the right message is always a challenge. We have different audiences that we need to speak to, and getting that message right for the right audience takes a lot of attention to detail. Getting people to attend and show up and care about the material. I know we've all been at public meetings where sometimes we have hundreds of people turn up, but other times we have 6 people, 10 people, and getting those people to attend and care is a challenge for us. Getting proper resources, having collaboration amongst various stakeholders is definitely a challenge for risk communication. And this last one, just this idea that floods just happen. And we have areas that flood repeatedly, and we still sometimes get folks that are surprised when that flooding happens. Let's start with the infamous 100-year storm. It seems like a simple definition, an event with a 1% chance of being equaled or exceeded in a given year. Back in college, I'd taken a lot of math, probably up through Cal 3 before I took a statistics class. And I remember thinking, statistics is going to be a piece of cake. It's just marbles in a bag, right? And so I was really surprised by how confusing some of the concepts were in statistics and probability. So we've got to remember that if probability is confusing for the engineers and the math nerds out there, it's really confusing for a lot of our other stakeholders in the public. And this 100-year flood standard has also given rise to a lot of myths and misconceptions. So I'm going to walk through just a handful of those. This first is that if I'm outside the 100-year floodplain, I don't need flood insurance. Obviously, this is not the case, and this is kind of this binary in or out misconception that exists out there, where if someone's in the 99-year floodplain, they need insurance, but if they're in the 101-year floodplain, then they're fine and they don't have to worry about it. I'm going to talk a little bit later about some ways to challenge that thought. Here's the other, where we've lived here 50 years and never seen a flood. There's a lot of challenges with this myth. Some of that stems from just the probability aspect of you can live somewhere 50 years and see 500-year floods or no 100-year floods. But the other piece that is very important is this idea of non-stationarity. The development conditions in the past are different from today. The rainfall and the storm events that we're seeing are not the same as they were 50 years ago either. And so that changes our flood risk all the time. You get a lot of people that think of the 100-year as a worst-case scenario. It's something that's going to roll around every 100 years, but it's not going to happen in my lifetime. As we've seen recently, in Michigan, there's a lot of other flood risk out there from dam breaches and levee failures that are potentially far worse scenarios than just your standard 100-year flood event. And so it's important to convey that other risk that doesn't always show up on every floodplain map. And then finally, this idea that I don't live near a river and so I'm not at risk of flooding. And this is another issue that I think has kind of popped up here in the last few years of fluvial versus pluvial flood risk. The difference between flood risk that we get from rivers and streams and then the pluvial or rainfall-based flood risk, where just the water is just trying to get to the channel or the system that's in place. So the next question I have is basically just a wish list for these people. If you can have anything to help communicate risk better, what would you want? This is a great answer here, historic maps of flooding. And if you do some Googling, there are some historic maps of flooding, like for the 1927 Mississippi River flood. But a lot of times there's not mapping of historic events. And when flooding does happen, we have a lot of other more important things to do right then and there. And we get focused on that, and a lot of times we don't go back and capture accurately where that flooding was. And then there's also that idea of capturing future flooding as well. More access to data on mobile devices, it's definitely something we're seeing more and more of, and that's a good thing. This was an interesting comment back on related to development. Analyzing and evaluating fully developed watershed conditions as it relates to development is always a challenge. And there's a lot of different communities have different approaches to that, and it's another hot topic that's out there that we need to improve our communication of flood risk. Participatory mapping tools. A great example that I've seen recently is Texas AgriLife Extension's CHARM tool. And this is something that just gets people around the table. It makes the data very accessible and easy to use, and gets people working together to just talk about flood risk together. So if you haven't seen that, I encourage you to look that up. Just getting in people's faces, this is really important. The Turnaround Don't Drown campaign has been very important, but and it's helped. But I think there's some people out there that just need some kind of kill switch in their car that will keep them from driving into these low water crossings. It's still a big challenge that we have. And then finally, I love this one. This person just wished big, wished for the impossible. But I think this is kind of the ultimate goal here for all of us, is to get the layperson, the average Joe, to just understand, explain flood risk accurately in their own terms. So let's move into an example here on how to talk about and present this sort of spectrum of flood risk. This is a study from Greece. I put the source down in the bottom. I encourage you to take a look at this study. It's a quick read. It's a really interesting study that was done. it actually doesn't use any kind of hydraulic modeling, which is actually very cool, I think, even though I love 2D modeling as much as the next person. But it's an index-based GIS model, and so it takes a gridded data for these 7 different parameters that you see here: flow accumulation, rainfall intensity, geology, land use, slope, elevation, and distance from the drainage network. So they gather all that data. They did a pairwise ranking system to determine the weighting of each of those parameters to be used. And the great thing that you see here is that every area in this watershed shows some risk. Obviously up there in the mountaintops, you've got very low flood risk, but it does show, hey, there is potentially some risk there. Down in the streams and the valleys below, you've got very high risk. And in between, you've got this spectrum of flood risk. And so you can see some of these villages here have low to very low risk. Others are right there in that very high risk zone. So this is a very intriguing study. Again, I encourage you to take a look at it because I'm really interested in seeing this methodology. Okay, I had to have a RAS-2D slide. I think it's actually a requirement for all technical presentations now. But identifying and communicating pluvial flood risk using HEC-RAS-2D radon mesh analysis has really actually been a great tool for a lot of us out there. You know, most flood studies that we see in flood risk maps are based on fluvial flooding. But when you get out there and talk to stakeholders, you hear that a lot of the frequent flooding, either nuisance flooding or even severe flooding, happens from these pluvial heavy rainfall events. The Louisiana Watershed Initiative did this great listening tour last year where they had all these different public meetings across the state to just gather input from stakeholders. I went to the one in Monroe, Louisiana, and I was struck by nearly every comment from a local person there related more to their streets flooding or their house flooding from these rainfall events where it just rains a couple inches in an hour or something. So there wasn't that big 100-year flooding from the river concern about flood risk, which was obviously still a risk. But there was really more about the pluvial flooding. And so the modeling effort that's about to be undertaken as part of the Louisiana Watershed Initiative is really mainly still focused on riverine flooding and coastal flooding. And so we realize that we still need to have a way to address this and communicate this pluvial flooding risk as we go into that work. And the challenge behind this, it's a great tool, but the challenge is clearly communicating some of the assumptions and limitations behind this, because again, it is sometimes kind of a coarse analysis, but it is very insightful into where you get this kind of pluvial flood risk. So one of my last questions was, how do these folks see their role changing for flood risk? So this first one is great, less winging it. How many of us have been in a public meeting where we get a question from someone and we're just trying to come up with an answer on the spot, and sometimes we get kind of a mixed message when we do that. So definitely getting more structured messaging, going in intentionally knowing what are our talking points, what are we going to stick to, is very important as we communicate flood risk. Again, this linking of growth and development to flood risk and starting to plan out. There's a lot of different communities that do a good job of this, of looking forward and using kind of future conditions or future flooding for their planning and their development. Obviously, more use of technology and social media. And then this is, again, kind of where the rubber meets the road here, of facilitating this gap between the engineers, the scientists, the researchers, and the stakeholders and the public. That's really what our job is here. And this last one I really love is this term, reasonably uncomfortable, and making people reasonably uncomfortable talking about flood risk. And this person also kind of expanded on that in their response, that it's better to be uncomfortable now and make difficult but informed decisions than to be underwater, no pun intended, tomorrow. And so this really reminded me of a book I read called Crucial Conversations. It's a great book if you haven't read it. It's going to help you professionally and personally, but it gets to the point of how to have these difficult and honest conversations with people. Having those difficult conversations about flood risk is really the only way we're going to get people to start changing their behavior. And with that, we dive from 2 slides from 2D RAS to behavioral science. And again, I'm no expert on behavioral science, but I've been doing a lot of reading and research lately on this. And so here's what I've learned from behavioral science. It mainly exists between this context of the individual, what we think in our head, our interaction with society, and then the environment around us. So there's a lot of opportunities for things to go wrong between when we something gets our attention and then we have to make a decision and react to it. And that kind of boils down to these 4 major processes that happen. Number 1, we have a lot of mental shortcuts that we use. We have a lot of rules of thumb, guesses, approximations. These are important things for us. They help us in our day-to-day lives, but they can sometimes send us on the wrong path when we're presented with this complex information on flood risk. We have biases and aversions to certain concepts and ideas. Again, when we're presented with very complex information, and flood risk falls into that category, we definitely have a tendency to want to simplify that, find a simple answer. And then lastly, the human brain is terrific at filling in gaps in information, and we do this all the time in what we see and hear. But we definitely also do it in some of our problem solving. One of the ways all of this behavior is manifested that applies to flood risk is how we perceive probability versus the actual probability of some event. And so what the studies have shown is that people tend to overvalue low probability events like winning the lottery or getting a record deal. Something that is probably not going to happen, but we tend to think, well, somebody's going to win it, right? Our odds may be better than what the statistics are really reporting. On the flip side, for medium to high probability events, we tend to undervalue those. And so you think about folks that have a fear of flying, but are quick to hop in a car and make a 6-hour drive, but your risk of getting in a car accident are far greater than any kind of airplane incident. And so since we deal a lot in flood risk with probability and statistics, it's good for us to understand how we perceive probability versus what it really is, and communicating that difference. So where do we go from here? Obviously, I haven't solved the problem with unprecedented yet, but I have learned a lot along the way, and hopefully you have too. I kind of boiled it down to these last 4 items. Number 1 is to have a clear message. Take the time to sit down with your team, with your stakeholders, before you go out to a meeting. Make sure you have a clear message and you know what it is that you want to convey and what you want people to walk away from that meeting understanding. Accept and acknowledge uncertainty. Again, our models have a lot of uncertainty built into them, and sometimes we don't do a very good job of explaining that to people. It's okay to accept uncertainty as long as we can quantify it and communicate to people that there is that uncertainty there, and helping people know that it's not about being in or out of the floodplain, it's about that spectrum of risk and where you fall along that spectrum. Stay focused on those simple truths. Again, everybody's got some flood risk. Everyone needs to understand that simple truth. And finally, don't be afraid to make people reasonably uncomfortable. I think sometimes that's the only way to get to a change in behavior, get to a change in thinking, is to cross that threshold of crucial conversations with people. Finally, I want to leave you with this last quote from Antonio Damasio. And I really like this quote. It says, "Emotion, feeling, and biological regulation all play a role in human reason. We are not thinking machines, we are feeling machines that think." And so getting down to feelings and emotions, I know engineers, we want to kind of turn that side of our brain off and we want to focus on the math and the probability. But you see this picture here, these people's lives are at stake, and their livelihoods and their homes. That's what it really boils down to. And if we want those people to change where they live and how they live, we've got to change their way of thinking and feeling and how we communicate flood risk. So thank you for listening today, and now I'll take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Jim, for that presentation. That was really good. I really liked some of your pictures and graphics. Usually you see the
Thank
same
you.
ones over and over, and you definitely did not in this one. And some of your messages they were very good. I really enjoyed it. And I've written down that book I'm going to buy, Crucial Conversations. Is that the name of the book?
Crucial Conversations, yep.
Yes, I have
It's a
jotted
must
that
read.
down. Yes. So we have quite a few minutes for questions. If any of you have a question for Jim about his presentation, please enter it into the chat box, and I'll let Jim make a few remarks while we're waiting for folks to enter their questions.
Sure. Yeah, I was just thinking, kind of re-watching this, it's such a challenge for us because we can't just not use this word unprecedented when we have these large, rare flood events. As floodplain managers, we're constantly trying to like pound into people's head, like, this is significant, this is big, this is important. And so we want to use these words that kind of try to convey that, but then, it starts to get drowned out with some of the rest of the noise. And so that's just the challenge that I wanted to try and address, and the topic that I wanted to cover. I did see a comment here on the tie-in with equitable engagement. And that's been a topic I've seen come up a lot in some other presentations today. And I agree, it's definitely a challenge that we have, and an opportunity really as we go in. A lot of these pictures that you saw in the presentation were actually from flooding in northern Louisiana in 2016. A good friend of mine named Gabe Cardinality got out and took a lot of these photos in a boat, and just got out there literally in the storm to take these photos. But as I'm going to be working on the Louisiana Watershed Initiative project, and that's one of the things I think we're going to have to do is just really engage local leaders where they are, communities of faith, everybody that we can get to try to get that messaging out there and make people reasonably uncomfortable.
So we do have a question asking if you have examples of better communication of risk. Do you have some examples, Jim?
The CHARM tool that I mentioned, and somebody asked about that, and so I responded to Audra, I believe, with a link to that, to the Texas AgriLife website. That tool is a great example where they basically kind of have this set up with a computer and a projector, but it projects down onto a table. And so it's a tabletop exercise essentially, but it's driven with GIS data. And it's very easy to use. The interface is very easy to use, even if you're, just have limited familiarity with GIS. You get around the table and it just gets people together in kind of small groups talking about things, and really driving the conversation. And it's a fantastic tool.
And Jim, someone's also asking, who's the author of the book, Crucial Conversations? Do you remember who the author is?
I'll have to Google. I don't remember off the top of my head.
That's okay. All right.
Let me
And
Google that for you.
then someone asked if you studied under Freud. So our friend Pam Roach is asking, what do you mean when you say, quote, have a clear message? Isn't clarity subjective?
Yeah, that's probably true. I think what I was speaking to there is kind of that comment of winging it, and making sure that we have, maybe it's less clear message, is consistent messaging, and knowing our audience. And so because clarity is subjective, I can use a lot of different terminology if I'm going in to talk to a bunch of engineers versus going in to talk to just the general public or planners or different types of people. And so I think that's where you got to get that clarity, is really knowing your audience and who you're going to speak to. And that can be a challenge because a lot of times, Jerry and I have been in situations in New Orleans together of talking to just a wide range of people, and trying to get that clear message is hard. It's hard to do.
Yes, it is. So I have just found the link to the book, Crucial Conversations. I'll post it in the chat
Thank you.
for everyone. Yeah. All right. So any more questions? I don't think so. I think that's it. All right. Well, thank you, Jim.
Mark Johnson giving me a hard time about studying on the field.
You know, it's not often we find a really good engineer that also can speak English to people. So I appreciate Jim so much. And miss working with Jim. So
yes.
So thank you for the presentation, Jim. It was really good.
Thank you, Jerry.
And all right. So we will just move right on to our last presentation by Kate Skaggs with Resilience Action Partners. So let's cue that presentation now.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is Wendy Shaw from FEMA Region 10, and today we're going to talk about leveraging the power of story for local mitigation action in Oregon. And joining me today is Brian, Karin, Laura, and Kate. And Brian, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Wendy. Yeah, this is Brian Eberhardt. I'm emergency manager and project manager for the Multnomah County Drainage District in Portland, Oregon. And through FEMA's other great work in the Pacific Northwest, we've had this idea of using storytelling and stories from our community in the Portland area as tools to raise awareness about flood risk and our levee system. The project we created is called Life Along the Columbia, Stories from Behind the Levee, and we're aiming for a summer to fall public release of this. It is our hope that by sharing people's personal connection to this place and illuminating what the levees protect, the people will be more likely to take action. So, through a public event in August of 2019, we collected stories from 17 volunteer participants. Today we want to share a part of Sunny Simpkins' story. She's the Deputy Director of Planning, Policy, and Finance for MCDD.
I was born and raised in Houston, Texas, and so from a very young age I've experienced flooding. Growing up there, hurricanes were part of life, lights going out, big rains, and not knowing if you're going to school the next day or if somebody's house was going to be underwater. My first flood, I was 5. It was Hurricane Alicia, and I'll remember that because my little sister was like 5 or 6 months old, and her name's Alicia. And then I went to school for geology and went to school in Austin, where again, there was a lot of surface water flooding from the river there, and we had a lot of dams. And so just kind of understanding the play between where we live and how we always congregate around water, because that's like commerce and ease of having the benefits of being around water, but at the same time trying to do it smartly and not minimize our risk based on also having the convenience of living near water.
Sunny left Texas and made her way to the Pacific Northwest in 2002. She shares about how different the mentality is here from Texas.
One thing that's different about the West Coast and living on a river that has dams on it is that we're more complacent about it, and it's not in the forefront of our mind. So that's when you tell people there is a levee district here in Portland, they're like, what? We don't have flooding. It doesn't happen all the time, but it will happen again, and we need to be prepared and know how to react when it does happen.
As Sunny points out, one of our challenges in the Pacific Northwest is that flooding doesn't happen every day or even every year, so people forget, to get comfortable, to get complacent. It's our hope that by sharing stories like Sunny's about people who live, work, and recreate within our levee system, that we can help mitigate risks to our community, getting them ready for that next flood.
And my name is Kate Skaggs, and I've been supporting FEMA Region 10, the mitigation planning program. And we have been supporting the Multnomah County Drainage District to connect this project to other story projects in Region 10. So previously, starting in 2017, we supported Pierce County, Washington, and Thurston County, Washington, do their own Power of Story projects. And so this information will be posted between now and next January for you to take a look at their projects as well.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, the levee system in Portland is at the confluence of the Columbia and Willamette rivers. It's at the end of the Columbia River Basin. The basin is the second largest in the United States. It has a series of multi-benefit dams that are used for hydropower, recreation, and most importantly to us, flood storage. The Multnomah County Drainage District manages 3 other levee districts along the southern shore of the Columbia River, protecting around 12,500 acres that includes a mixture of industrial, commercial, residential, and natural areas. Our two most important assets that we protect are the Portland International Airport and the City of Portland's backup water supply. MCD exists to enhance community safety and support the region's vitality by doing the following. We reduce flood risk through levee and drainage maintenance. We have 12 pump stations and 27 miles of levee that we maintain. We prepare for and respond to emergencies and learn from them, and then build upon partnerships to support that work throughout our region. I'm going to pass it over to Kaden to talk a little bit more about our flooding history here in Portland.
Thank you, Brian. This is Kaden. So over the last 100 years, the area we serve has experienced 5 major flood events in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and most recently in 1996, which was declared a statewide federal emergency. The city of Vanport, however, was built as a temporary housing project in the managed floodplain to support the shipbuilding efforts during World War II. At its peak, over 40,000 people were crammed in 650 acres. Community stories shared now describe how workers would rotate day and night shifts because there weren't enough beds for everyone. After the war ended, discriminatory policies such as redlining made it very difficult for people of color to live or purchase homes in many areas of the city. As a result, many African Americans remained in Vanport after the war ended. In 1948, on Memorial Day weekend, a railroad embankment on the western part of the system breached, and the entire city was wiped away in a matter of hours. Over 18 people lost their lives. While Vanport happened over 70 years ago, the flood risk is still very real today. We see high water events persist in the spring, which now threaten vulnerable, unhoused communities that often camp in low-lying areas. The power of story helps us to build relevance, understand how to encourage awareness, and empower self-preparedness in our communities.
And moving forward with bringing all of the context together from the larger story projects in Region 10 down to the specific project supporting Multnomah County Drainage District and the flood history that was just mentioned. This project took about 1 year, and we are still finalizing the products from it. Started preparing for a regatta last August. We prepared for the individual interviews, transcribing the interviews, moving through internal trainings to help be able to learn how to use story as a risk communications tool. Now we're developing the promotional material to support the audio interviews. This information will be available again as the presentation is posted in case you want to be able to do a similar project within your community.
So these are some of the photographs that were captured during the Columbia Slough Watershed Council Regatta event that MCD hosted in the summer of 2019. And the Columbia Slough Regatta is an annual festival hosted by the Columbia Slough, a local nonprofit organization that invites over 400 community members to learn about and celebrate the Columbia Slough through canoeing and nature-based activities. The Columbia Slough actually runs parallel to the Columbia River and is within the managed floodplain and falls within the area that the district manages and maintains. At the event, we hosted a storytelling booth to collect stories of people who work, recreate, and call the managed floodplain home. Among participants were community activists working to increase engagement of the Latinx community in sustainability, active transportation, and environmental conservation efforts. Mauricio, pictured on the slide on the top left, has volunteered as a paddle team member with the Columbia Slough for over 5 years, leading paddle trips with communities who had never experienced a watershed before and increasing outreach to the Latinx communities. He shared how important it was for agencies not only to invest in, but also prioritize public education efforts to empower communities to self-prepare and understand how to respond to emergencies. On the top right, we see Ubaldo, who grew up in Mexico City and is now an organizer at the Columbia Riverkeeper. He was unaware of the flood protection systems MCDD managed until a recent event and encouraged MCDD through his own story to think about how to manage infrastructure in ways that consider the impact on the environment, which in turn impact communities, their health, physical and mental well-being. A group of local organizers called the ABC, or Andando en Bicicletas y Caminando, which translates to walking and biking together, shared their experiences participating in MCDD's annual Bike the Levees event earlier in the year. In the spring, they rode with over 60 community members and toured the levee system by bike to learn about the history of Vanport and the way in which MCDD manages its infrastructure. All of these stories allow us to understand our community's values, their experiences and perspectives, and to share the work that they do. Now we're going to play a short clip of a conversation among the ABC group at the regatta event.
MCDD organiza un evento de bicicletas llamado Bike the Levees para que los miembros de la comunidad puedan aprender sobre la historia del área y la infraestructura de protección contra inundaciones. En la primavera del 2019, los miembros del grupo ABC se unieron a más de 60 miembros de la comunidad en un recorrido por el sistema de picos. La ruta incluyó una presentación de Ed Washington, quien vivió en la ciudad de Vanport hasta que su familia perdió todo por la inundación a la edad de 10 años.
Él estaba niño cuando pasó ese evento, nos iba explicando qué es lo que había aquí, lo que había, que era fábrica, tiendas donde él se acordaba. Para mí personal me conmovió y yo nunca había visto fotos de qué tan grande fue la magnitud de ese desastre. Necesito la información y así poder tenerlo en mente. Esperemos que nunca pase, pero pues nunca, tampoco nadie sabe si se va a pasar o no va a pasar. Muy útil la información y así tenerlo en mente y tener algo listo para si llegue ese caso.
A mí me da miedo más, porque como siempre ando por acá cerca, vivo cerca y es donde voy a comprar.
Cuando se desbloquea a mis hijas las fotos, ellas están como, ¿va a volver a pasar? Y son conscientes de que nunca, que ni en la escuela le habían dicho de eso, ellos no lo sabían.
Es muy impresionante con las fotos, de que nadie quiere que pase otra vez, pero estoy mirando que de la documentación de 1894, 1933, Stanford en 98, 96, 64, Navidad, 96, y hasta reciente 2017 ha habido actividades del agua que se ha inundado mucho. He escuchado mucha gente que se está nervioso, tiene ansiedad de un terremoto que va a pasar a Polen. Siento que sí, eso es algo que tomar a cuenta, pero se me hace que una inundación es más posible que un terremoto.
Yeah, I love that last line where they talk about how a flood is more likely than an earthquake, but doesn't get as much attention. I think it's just really empowering to us at MCD to keep that in mind, that it's not necessarily on people's minds every day, so we have a responsibility to help people be aware of that. So we collected, as I mentioned earlier, 17 participants' stories, and we edited them down to about 8 that we're going to be releasing this coming fall in a flood risk outreach campaign, and kind of in preparation for next year's flood season. We anticipate sharing these stories at virtual events in our community and like this, as well as through mailers to our landowners and through social media. Here are a few samples of our current materials. Listed in this picture, we have Sunny, who you saw earlier, Colin Rowan, and Jennifer Starkey. Next slide. One of the important themes for the regatta this year that we co-hosted was the Slough is for All. It's the goal of encouraging people from all backgrounds to enjoy nature in their backyard while reducing barriers like access and language through recreation. As a part of this event, we held levee and pump station tours to help people to see how our work impacts and ties into the natural areas that they care about within the urban area of Portland. And our overall, all of our stories have some sort of connection to either living, working, or playing, and often the people share all three of those together in their stories.
So one thing that was powerful through this process was not only the collection of the stories and the relationship building we had with those community members, but also a reflection as communication practitioners. So stories are something that help us to connect, to relate to each other, and to empathize with our experiences. And what we learned through this process is that we are all storytellers, even though sometimes we tend to be the ones that may be doing the writing or maybe doing the videography behind the camera. But in order to ethically collect other people's stories and build those relationships, we must be able to share our own. So part of what we did through this process is we hosted 2 workshops. The first was focused on telling our own story and understanding our own biases and our own values that show up in the way that we tell our own story, but then also to create awareness in the way that we might tell someone else's. The second workshop was hosted by a nonprofit partner, the Vanport Mosaic, to help practitioners understand informed consent and how improper storytelling could unintentionally perpetuate harm or systemic oppression, especially for communities who may be sharing stories that revive forms of trauma or negative experiences that they may have had. Both workshops gave people an opportunity to reflect at an individual, organizational, and institutional level, which is essential when you're asking individuals to share potentially traumatic or painful memories. I'm going to pass it on to Lauda, who was one of the presenters at that second workshop.
Thank you, Karen. And let's start by thinking about, we all intuitively know that there's lots of power in stories, but why is that? So I like to think about what actually a story is. A story is the building blocks of a community, right? They create a reality. Stories can shape the way we see and respond to communities' needs. So there is lots of powers in this decision that we make in terms of how we represent in communities. Are we going to represent in a way that invites support, initiatives and policies that truly benefit the communities, or we create a narrative that in a way justify or even invites disinvestment, oppression, and erasure of that community? So that's why it's so important to think about a compassionate and ethical storytelling framework. The first step that I like to think about when I embark personally on a storytelling project is considering the power dynamics involved in that storytelling process. Who gets to make the decisions, who asks the questions, who gets to tell the story, who even determines if that story is worthy to be told, who is going to listen. So there's no really magical formula to do storytelling in an ethical and moral framework. And I like to think of it as a messy, a continual decision-making process. Is a series of questions that you constantly have to ask yourself and your team. Again, it's messy, it takes lots of time, it involves vulnerability, and it involves mistakes and feeling uncomfortable. And I think that is one of the main reasons often we avoid this whole reflection. And we tend to go back to the more traditional transactional model of getting stories in a kind of in an extractive way. We go out, we need the story for our own purpose, no matter how positive it is, it's still extractional. We tell a story about, in one way, about that community, and we parachute ourselves in communities we often don't have any relationship with, and so we don't have any understanding of. So a more ethical and compassionate framework is one that, first of all, it has to be embedded in all stages of the project and not being an afterthought. We want to think of the questions that I started with from the design stage, and then to think through as we collect stories and then we share them and publish them, and even a step that we often forget of, which is how we're going to archive them and preserve them. So we advocate for a relational framework that holds space for stories, tells stories with and not about, and again, it's a place where we honor and acknowledge people's experience, and we celebrate their strength and their resilience. We often talk about the legal aspect of storytelling, right? We talk about the informed consent, and we have all our paperwork ready to go, and that is critical, obviously. But think about that, the informed consent process also from a moral, ethical standpoint. That document and our commitment to preserve the dignity of our communities and to elevate their experience, that is what that document is about. And so it's a human relationship, right? And I like to remind myself and all of us working with stories that just because something is legal doesn't mean it's right and we should do it. So go in with your heart and let's tell two stories together.
Thank you, Laura. It's been a great year working with FEMA and Vanport Mosaic on this project, and we're excited about the next steps and continuing the momentum going forward for through our Fall 2020 Flood Awareness Campaign, by weaving stories and risk communications into our hazard mitigation plan that we're doing for the first time, and by continuing to build on these relationships and partnerships, like with the Vanport Mosaic, to help our community ultimately be better prepared for the next major flood event. So to sum up the project and our experiences with the workshop, we wanted to share a few kind of closing thoughts from the project perspective. Ultimately, we strongly believe that story is a powerful risk communications tool, that data by itself or maps is only so effective, and so stories can help support behavioral change. Another thing is that story projects should be community driven. They should come up from trust and relationships, and we should have not too much of an agenda when we approach these. The questions that were asked by the interviewers to them was to keep them open-ended, to see what people wanted to share and to learn what people cared about in our community. And then when you get down to the nuts and bolts of this, I think a few things to keep in mind are that it's difficult at the beginning of a story project to know what you're going to hear, especially when you don't have a really tight agenda. So establishing clear goals with all the people that are involved in the project, and also being willing to iterate and live with uncertainty is really important. Also, to do informed consent, like Laura talked about and so did Karen, it takes extra time. So you should plan on it's taking longer than maybe is your ideal, keeping that in mind. And lastly, we wanted to say that part of ethical storytelling and working with partners and local community leaders is, we should be elevating their voices and not trying to broadcast our own. And we should also be compensating people. In this case, we gave everyone who told us their story an emergency kit to walk away with, just as a little thank you for giving us something of themselves.
Hello again, everybody. So Wendy Shaw from FEMA Region 10, and I'm an engineer in the risk analysis branch, focusing mostly on floodplain studies and mapping. And I'd like to just kind of wrap this up and how this all fits into FEMA and our risk management directorate priorities, and then especially Region 10. Our goal in Region 10 is to translate those priorities from our headquarters into action by getting to know our communities. And this storytelling and the way of capturing people's personal information about flood especially is a great way to do that. And communications and outreach is definitely part of developing those hazard mitigation plans. As Brian mentioned, they're working on updating. So at Region 10, we try to focus on some creativity within that risk map process. And you'll see on the slide, the yellow arrows indicate opportunities where we have found a connection point in that we can start communicating a little bit differently, not so much on the regulatory side of developing the flood insurance rate map, but definitely looking more towards what is that risk awareness, what kind of mitigation activities can be done towards that, and how do we develop and encourage resilient communities. And so as you can see, we at discovery, at scoping, and of course the multi-hazard risk assessment, so when we're expanding beyond just a flood study. And then, of course, the resilience workshop, which is where this project with MCDD really got going, was after the 2018 Multnomah County Resilience Meeting. So I like to really just take this opportunity to thank Brian and Karin, Laura and Kate for all their hard work on this presentation, and then their hard work in their communities, and the never-ending pursuit for the community awareness and action and resilience. Thank you so much for attending this presentation.
Well, thank you for that presentation. What a very, very interesting collaborative process. We have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you have not typed your question into the chat, please do so. And then we will get to your question as well. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Brian and let the crew make a few closing comments.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful project for us. It's been kind of a new foray for us in risk communications. We've never done something like this before, but we were just so happy to have the support of Kate and Ida and Lisa and Beatrice, as well as Wendy, to be able to do this project. To have the chance to listen to people, to hear their stories, and just give them room to talk with us, and not so much to talk to them. And so it's been wonderful. It's been challenging. It's because it's iterative in nature. We've had to grow and push ourselves, and it's taken longer than we thought, but it's been really great. And I've also really appreciated working with Laura, as well as Kelly Mullen, who helped present in the storytelling workshop. So it's been great. I'm interested to see people's questions, so I'll stop talking until Jerry has a question for us. Thanks.
So we do have one question in the chat from Brian Jones asking, what are examples of what you saw where a story intentionally or unintentionally perpetuated an inequity or injustice or otherwise broke the ethics guidelines? So who would like to take that question?
Well, I'd like to address that. This is Laura. Again, I consider myself a story midwife, and that's my passion and my call in terms of how we do this in a storytelling in an ethical framework. And I can mention even my own project. I've been part of a collective we've been really committed in harvesting stories around the Davenport flood, which happened in 1948. And survivors are still here with us. They're in the 80s and 90s. And we noticed that even before we started our own project, there was a lot of trauma around these stories in the way it was previously recorded and covered even by the mainstream media. And so what we noticed is that people didn't want to share the story anymore because there is this extractive and unethical and insensitive approach to go into communities who are still traumatized even after this many years, and not considering the trauma that is kind of reinforced when we ask people to repeat a story that's painful. And so we realized that there is that level of trauma, and there is the trauma of seeing their own stories never really properly honored in the way that they felt beneficial to the impacted communities. So I don't know how much intentionally that happened. This happens often, and as a former journalist, I realized this is actually a very common approach. and there's no consideration in how painful it is to repeat a story, and then maybe even seeing that story taken and used for purposes that are not beneficial to those who tell the story. So that's an example that I can bring from my own experience.
That's very interesting. And I know in doing some disaster response work, it's very saddening. And you can tell that the people, it's very difficult for them to convey their experience and their story. And so that's very interesting. We do have one more question from Cindy Wers. She says that we mentioned we were going to push stories out around the fall. How are we going to share the stories? Social media, posting on a webpage. She thinks it's a fascinating project, which I agree. So how are you going to share some of those stories? I don't know who would like to answer that.
I can jump in. So I'm Karen Carrillo, and I have been working really closely with everyone on this project. It truly has been an incredible collaboration across government and nonprofit sector. And so the way that we plan to share is definitely through some social media campaign and through a series of newsletters. So in the project, we covered that the stories that were collected were of people who lived, worked, and recreated in the floodplain. And so we hope to have themes that cover the stories in those categories, and also just enhance where they overlap. We are also, in addition to social media and our website, and we're looking at some multimedia options. And so looking at story maps as a way where we can tell these stories together and not only separate, because they complement each other in the way that the communities embrace, and also their relationship to the place. And then we have been talking about having, some of the public meetings that we host, having some kind of wireless free headphones that we can actually present. And some of the demographics in our service area are also a little bit older. And so trying to have technology that is accessible to them, where, people who may not have access to a computer or may not be able to engage with that material, we can actually bring the material to them and share those stories that way.
Okay. Could you post your website in the chat, and that way everyone can maybe bookmark that and look out for some of those messages? Would that be okay?
Yeah, I would be happy to do that.
Great. And then Cindy had another question. She says, the folks that spoke to you with their stories, did any of those people share anything about how they have mitigated or prepared for future disasters?
It's a good question. I'm trying to think about the different stories. I know you only got a clips of a couple of them. Most of what I heard was an encouragement for us to make sure that these are folks that are aware, and they just want to make sure their communities are aware too, and that for us just to keep going and doing more communications and reaching out to these various leaders. So I heard that more than I heard specific mitigation actions. Where we live and work is protected by almost a 500-year flood event level levee. So it doesn't flood a lot. So it's just hard to keep it pressing for people. But there is local flooding that happens. And so I think I didn't hear a ton of that, but I heard just yes, we want more. Keep telling us more information, getting into our community. Anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, Brian, I think, from one of the clips that were played from the ABC group and the group of Latinx leaders, there was an interest in having focus groups where people could learn more about the history of flooding. And, one of the projects that we've been working on is delivering some classroom curriculum around flood awareness. And that includes a physical flood model that simulates floods and ways of mitigation. And so when that was shared with them, they were very interested in having a more holistic understanding of the flood risk and ways of mitigating. So we would probably look to, one of the beauties about the storytelling piece and the approach of having an ethical storytelling approach is that it really focuses on relationship building. And so this was really an introductory opportunity for us to learn about people's understanding and history with this place, but it isn't where we're going to stop. So after the release of those stories in the fall, we hope to be able to continue those conversations with those individuals and groups.
It also helped us expand our understanding of what mitigation is. So it's not just a structural solution, but it's also education and awareness, things like preserving natural floodplain functions, but also social cohesion. So events like the regatta and bringing people together to talk about personal and lived experiences. If we're looking at opportunities for investment in mitigation, that social cohesion is a really big component of that. So just trying to get more creative about what a mitigation actually means.
Very good. That's interesting. Very good. So we have another question that is asked by Anna Sarah Labette. I'm sorry if I just butchered your name. It says, for this particular community, what have been the main changes in policy or local mitigation actions coming from the storytelling project? So have you seen any mitigation actions directly from this project? Maybe too soon? I don't know.
That was what I was going to say, more or less. So this is almost the first time that anyone outside of our project team has heard this. So I would say at this stage, we're more in we've built the relationship, we've heard the stories, we've created products, and this fall we intend to get the word out more. So it's early stages. That being said, it is one of our intentions, and I have one of the 8 stories that will be shown eventually. And it is one of our intentions just to hear from people and have their words incorporate into our mitigation plan. So the number one thing I would say is just that I heard was keep doing more of this, keep communicating more often, help us to be aware so that we can take action. So I think it was just sort of identifying there is a gap in our communication, not that we're not doing anything, it's just that we can do more. And so that's helpful for us to bring back to our leadership and say, people want to hear more about this. Let's get the word out and let's fund that as well.
Yeah, well, that ties directly to the next 2 questions, which are related. Dennis Dixon asked, how does a community get their stories recorded? And Janelle Santos was asking, are there plans to expand the storytelling process to other parts of the nation?
Well, Dennis Dixon is actually our point of contact for the Pierce County storytelling. So he may be asking for someone else, but it is reaching out to either your state risk map coordinator, your state national flood insurance program coordinator. This again is funded through FEMA's CERT contract. So whoever is responsible for that, I know that looks different in every FEMA region, and similar projects are already in FEMA regions 9 and 3, and I have heard of a couple of other regions, but so far it's been region specific.
Okay. So Stacy L. with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is asking, is this a national initiative by FEMA? And can you talk more about the FEMA storytelling training? She thinks she saw a slide on the storytelling training. So who wants to take that one?
Wendy, do you want to take it or do you want me to? So this is also provided through the CERT contract, which focuses on creative ways of risk communication. So what, in addition to engineering and technical data, can support a more holistic understanding of flood risk? And part of that, an important part, is communications. So training is also a part of that contract with FEMA.
Okay, so we have a few more questions asking about how this was funded. And so this was part of the CERC program. What does the CERC acronym stands for? I'm going to get it wrong if I try to say it.
Community engagement and risk communications. And Wendy, I don't know if you want to take more of that.
No, that's great. So I just wanted to add what Kate said as well, that it's all about doing a better job of communicating and how do we incorporate that. When you're fortunate enough to have a risk map project in your community, we're talking about these storytelling trainings already, and we're discussing ways, better ways to communicate what's happening for the project. If you don't have one in your community, do exactly what Kate suggested. Reach out to your state components, reach out to your FEMA regional people. And this is, I think Region 10 is a leader in developing these and getting these going. And I think our partnerships with MCDD is fantastic. And I wish that we could do more of this. I wish we could do this with all of the communities that we serve. And I hope that it's more of a catalyst to do this much, much more often and much, much more consistently.
Okay, so I think we might have just enough time for our last question. It looks like in the in the chat from Naisha Foster. She says, it's a little bit off topic, but what was the quote that you guys used again? Emotion, feeling, and biological regulation all play a role in human reason, something along those lines. Does anybody remember that quote?
Is that from our presentation or the prior one? I think it might have been the prior one, but maybe I remember wrong, Laura, Cotton. They're all smiling, so I don't think it's us.
Okay, all right. You're off the hook on that one.
Yes.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, so I think that's it. Great job, you guys. That was.
Thank you all for listening. Yeah, thanks, Jerry.
All right, bye, everybody.
Thank you.